Right guys, how's it going? I'm back again with another video on AMD, this time something really exciting though. I am of course talking about Ryzen. Before I start though, I'm just going to say that some of you may be getting a little bit tired about all the AMD news. And the reason for it all is we are in the middle of a tech bombardment by AMD. It's actually rather simple to figure out what's going on. If you look at a place like say Tech, we can see that here's an AMD article, and here's another one, and this was the new Crimson article. If you remember in the recent video, I talked about mindshare and how AMD lacks the kind of mindshare that other companies, for example Nvidia and Intel has. And one way to help with this is to save up all your tech stories and release them at the same time. Right before Christmas is a pretty good time to do it. And this is exactly what they are doing. So we've had the Crimson reveal and the new driver. Recently we heard about the new Radeon Instinct and Vega, and a day later we've got the new Ryzen CPU reveal. Now as you can see, I'm kind of working on a bunch of stuff here that is half finished, but I really do need to prioritise. And out of all of this, the biggest news is of course Ryzen. So that's just a little explanation about what's going on. So what I'm going to do in this video is take a look at the actual reveal itself, which was AMD's new HoRyzen event held on the 13th of December in Austin, Texas. I'm going to take a look at the interesting parts of the video and throw in a little bit of analysis there. Right, so first up, let's talk about the name, Ryzen. Some of you may have noticed a leak before this event, where the name was leaked. And obviously I saw that as well. And at first I thought it was Ryzen, which I think is actually better than Ryzen. I think they're maybe going for this HoRyzen thing. I'm not entirely sure though. But when I saw the name, I thought, well, it makes some kind of sense. It's not great, but I think it's probably alright. But Ryzen it is. You can tell me what you think about that one in the comments. Very nice intro for it though. I must say they're really upping their game in terms of all these videos and intros. Right, so moving quickly on to the interesting part. Straight away, Lisa Su, who is the president and CEO of AMD, announced that the slowest Zen CPU would start with a base clock of 3.4 GHz. Now up until this point, we'd seen some engineering samples out there that did around 3 GHz, or maybe even 2.8 GHz. And the rumour was that Zen was going to launch around about 3 to 3.2 GHz, with the assumption being 3 GHz for base clock, and possibly maybe 3.4 for a single core turbo. Now, the base clock is exactly what it sounds like. It is the base clock of the CPU. And then you get stuff like all-core turbos, which can be higher than the base clock. And obviously, the less cores that the CPU is using, the higher the clock speed is. That's what turbo is all about. But what Lisa here is saying is that the slowest Zen CPU will start at 3.4 GHz. That is a pretty high frequency for an 8-core, 16-thread CPU. The i7-6900K, for example, which is the CPU that Ryzen will most often be compared with in this video, coming in around $1,100, only has a base frequency of 3.2 GHz, with a maximum turbo up to 3.7. It also has this rather strange single-core turbo of 4 GHz, or around that level. But Zen, starting at 3.4, already appears to have the jump on the i7-6900K. in terms of clock speed. And Lisa also went on to say that all of the Ryzen CPUs will of course have a boost mode, but they aren't revealing the clock speeds until launch, which will be happening sometime over the next 3 months. It's really difficult to guess at what they're at, but we'll talk about that soon. Right, so next up, Lisa introduced AMD's Sense MI technology and started talking about neural net prediction and smart prefetch, most of which will be well over the heads of the average person. But it certainly sounds good, especially the neural net prediction part. Really what we're talking about here is technology that has been in these CPUs for decades. And what it's really all about is the CPU predicting what the next command it will receive will be. Rather than waiting to be told what to do and then doing it, the CPU sort of takes a guess at what the next command will be based on previous commands. Lisa claims that this neural net prediction and smart prefetch in Ryzen is responsible for around 25% of the IPC, that is instructions per clock, uplift compared to Bulldozer, which was actually notoriously bad for this. And one of the reasons why Bulldozer is so bad, this really just looks like marketing though. Obviously AI, neural nets, these are buzzwords right now, and AMD is really getting in on the marketing act. Now that's not to say that they don't have something new in there that nobody else has, we just don't know yet. But more than likely we're looking at an evolution of technologies that we have already seen in CPUs for decades.
Now next, we focused on getting ultimate performance from the machine. We literally have hundreds of sensors, hundreds, throughout Ryzen to sense and locally optimize the chip so that it can run at the fastest possible speed and at the lowest possible power. We call these features pure power and precision boost. Together, this is an amazing amount of control that allows us to dial up the frequency and dial down the power on each part of the chip independently in milliseconds, okay, milliseconds, with near perfect accuracy. If you want to talk about control, that's control.
Now all that sounds really impressive as well, but Lisa has basically just described turbo mode. There's been some talk about it though. It looks like the granularity is pretty good, and Ryzen's turbo can work in 25 MHz steps. Now this is a good thing because the more fine-grained the turbo is, the better it will be. But once again, we're talking about an evolution of technologies that we've had in CPUs for the past 5-6 years. Now this extended frequency range, which allows for higher turbo speeds based on how good the cooling is not particularly new technology either, but AMD appears to be taking it to another level. In a sense, we're talking overclocking, which the CPU does by itself, which is turbo, but in this case, the CPU does it even better based on how good your cooling is. If you've got a water-cooled Ryzen CPU, there is a very good chance that the turbo mode will increase further than if you have, say, a stock AMD cooler. This one's pretty interesting to think about though, and don't be surprised if Ryzen ships with a water cooler because of this, and I would be really surprised if the press samples are not water cooled as well. Hopefully we will see about that soon. Right, but let's be honest, like everybody else, you came for the benchmarks. And the first benchmark was one that we had already seen, where Ryzen was pitted against the aforementioned i7-6900K, both of which are of course 8-core, 16-thread CPUs. Now this one was interesting because AMD did a very similar demo a month or two ago, where both of the CPUs were locked at 3 GHz. And in that demo, which was a render using the Blender software, Zen won by a very small margin. In this case, Ryzen was clocked at 3.4 GHz, but with no turbo enabled. So in effect, Ryzen locked at 3.4 GHz. The 6900K, however, was straight out of the box. Now we already saw that the i7-6900K is a 3.2 GHz base clock CPU. And it also has an all-core turbo boost of 3.5 GHz. So in other words, when all the cores are loaded, the CPU should run at up to 3.5 GHz. It depends on one or two other things as well, for example how good the cooling is, but in most cases it should be running around 3.5 GHz in a load like Blender. And the final result appears to make sense. Both CPUs finished in almost identical time, which based on the previous demo, where both were clocked at 3 GHz, makes perfect sense. Zen won that one by a very small margin, and now they are almost equal. 3.4 GHz versus 3.5. That's what makes sense. But we'd seen that one before. But what was interesting is that AMD released the file, the Blender file itself, which can be downloaded on AMD.com by clicking on the new HoRyzen link. In true AMD fashion, they uploaded the wrong file. You can go to Blender and download the latest version, which is 2.7a, and also download AMD's file. Now once you install it, you're going to have it on the desktop, and you can drag the actual file to the desktop as well. At this point, all you need to do, drag it onto Blender, and here it is. Now what AMD got wrong was, this samples number is set to a render of 200. A lot of people on the web couldn't figure out how they'd got the numbers. This render number should be at 150. Press return and then F12 or render image. Now I'm using an i7-6700K here, but both the Ryzen and the i7-6900K finished this demo in around 36 seconds. My i7-6700K, which is of course just a quad core with 8 threads, takes around about 54 seconds. It's a little bit longer because I'm also recording right now as well. But I benchmarked it over and over and it takes 54 seconds. That's with hyper-threading on, and this is what I was actually testing. I then tested it with hyper-threading off and it took 1 minute 23 seconds. The reason for this was simple. I just wanted to know how big an effect hyper-threading was having on this demo. And in the case of the i7-6700K, hyper-threading makes the CPU 40% faster, which is around about the high end of what one would normally expect hyper-threading to contribute. So in other words, Blender scales very well with cores and very well with hyper-threading. So what we could be seeing here in this demo is Ryzen having a very strong hyper-threading implementation, or what I should say is simultaneous multi-threading, as hyper-threading is of course Intel's own term. There is just that worry there that perhaps Ryzen does one thing very well, and that is hyper-threading. So when the hyper-threading isn't working, then maybe the CPU not quite as fast as what it appears. But another interesting thing is that the Ryzen CPU matched the i7-6900K while using less power. And Lisa announced that this particular Ryzen CPU would be a 95 watt CPU. Now this is almost certainly the best silicon. This will be the best CPU in terms of performance per watt. But based on what she said earlier, about 3.4 GHz being the base clock, makes me believe that we should see higher clocked, higher TDP chips. I think one of the things here is AMD is keen to point out that they are ahead in efficiency terms at 95 watts with certain CPUs. But that doesn't mean that they won't kind of throw that efficiency out the window in order to be faster. The thing about clock speeds is the more you push it towards its limit, the less efficient they get. And it's quite possible that a 3.6 GHz Ryzen CPU could come in at 140 watts of power. While it may be faster overall than the 6900K, there is little chance of it being better in performance per watt. So what AMD is saying here is, look, we can be better in performance per watt as well, but here is our 140 watt CPU, which is less efficient than the 6900K, but hey, it's that bit faster as well. We shall see. But like I said, we had already seen the Blender demo, so it was really nice to see a new demo in the form of Handbrake. Now this one was particularly interesting because CPUs basically crunch two types of numbers. You've got integers and floating point numbers. And an application like Blender is very heavy on the floating point side of things. Handbrake is an application for transcoding video files. In other words, it changes a video file from one format to another. And in this next demo, the exact same setup again, Ryzen versus the 6900K, the Ryzen system finished transcoding the video in 54 seconds compared to 59 seconds of the Intel i7-6900K. So that was 10% faster. Now, in the previous demo a couple of months ago, I said that AMD was almost certainly showing their best case scenario with Blender, but that is clearly not the case. Once again, in this Handbrake benchmark, Ryzen was locked at 3.4 GHz compared to what is probably again 3.5 GHz of the Intel CPU. So Blender wasn't best case scenario, and it may well be that Handbrake isn't either. It is very unusual for AMD to not show their best case scenario. There could be a simple explanation, however. Perhaps they simply didn't have the Zen silicon on hand and they hadn't done enough testing with it. But it's interesting to think about, because if AMD is deliberately holding back on performance, then they could have something very special indeed. Like I said, Blender hits the floating point unit in the CPU. Handbrake is much more integer heavy. So once again, that is one less worry about Ryzen's performance. There was the worry that maybe it was good at floating point, not quite so good in integer, but this does not seem to be the case. And in fact, it is even better in integer than it is in floating point. Right, so what about gaming? Well, next up was Battlefield 1 at 4K resolution using a Titan X GPU. That's a Pascal Titan X. Both the 6900K and Ryzen were running at basically equal frame rates. Now, in a way, this is AMD saying, look, our new CPU is just as good as Intel's $1,100 CPU when it comes to gaming. But the reality is, at 4K, the graphics card should always be the limiting factor. Battlefield 1 and the developer DICE, their games in general, are pretty well threaded for CPUs. They work very closely with AMD, who are obviously pushing the multi-thread agenda. Looking at a game GPU benchmark, this is at 1080p. And we can see that even the FX 9590 is right up there with the 6700 and the 5960X. And even the old 2600K, which is an i7, remember, 8 threads, is quite a bit faster than the i5 6600, which is of course only a 4-core CPU. So Battlefield 1 is already very well threaded, and it even runs very well on the old FX processors. So this is not a great surprise to see Ryzen on par with the 5900K. It would be very disappointing if it weren't. So that doesn't really tell us an awful lot about how Ryzen will perform in maybe a more typical game. Now, continuing with gaming, we then saw Dota 2. In this case, a bunch of guys were playing the game while streaming, and in this case, an i7 6700K was also added to the benchmarks. Now, all three systems ran the game fine, but the i7 6700K was having trouble streaming the game at the same time. What this really all comes down to is number of cores and the number of threads. Ryzen and the 6900K, as I said earlier, are both 16-thread CPUs, whereas the i7 6700K only has 8 threads. What we're seeing here is the game itself is maybe using 4 or 5 threads, and the remaining threads of the i7 6700K are not strong enough to actually stream the game at the same time. It's a little bit of a cheat because if you had a 6700K, you would almost certainly be using QuickSync, which is the hardware-based encoder in the Skylake CPUs. In effect, what AMD has done here is deliberately choke the 6700K by forcing it to game and stream at the same time using the CPU threads. It's not a complete cheat because software or CPU-based encoding does give you a higher quality bitrate than these hardware-based encoders, and that includes GPU encoders as well, which we saw recently with Crimson Relive and Shadowplay. The quality is better if you do it on the CPU, so while it's a little bit cheaty, I'm just about gonna let them away with it. The last gaming demo that we saw was a new Star Wars Battlefront DLC, where once again we saw Ryzen, and this time AMD's upcoming Vega GPU, running the game at 4K. We didn't really learn an awful lot there in terms of performance. Right, basically wrapping this one up now. In my previous Zen video, I said that it all looks very promising. After having watched this, I would say it looks even more promising. There are still 1 or 2 questions there. We haven't really seen its single thread performance. AMD is hiding the clock speed. That could be great, or it could be bad. The thing about these multi-core CPUs is they generally don't have as high a maximum single core speed as CPUs like the i5s and the quad-core i7s. It's simply a trade-off. It's really difficult getting so many cores at such high clock speeds. And this can mean in 1 or 2 older applications and in very single-threaded games, these very high-thread CPUs can sometimes fall a little bit behind. But the turbo implementation can make up for that if it's good enough. And AMD are certainly saying theirs is something different and something beyond what we've seen before. If Ryzen's single thread can be above 4 GHz, then AMD has something very, very good indeed. And not just in these very heavy number crunching, very heavy workload benchmarks, but possibly in gaming as well. One thing's for sure, this is not another bulldozer, and it is clearly far beyond anything AMD has had in a very, very long time. Will it be good enough though? We haven't got long to wait before we find out. I'll catch you later, guys.